Good morning. Glad you're here. Happy New Year if I haven't gotten to tell you that so far. What a great morning we've already had just worshiping. I love hearing a room full of voices singing of God's grace and saying the highest praise, the loudest praise be to the name above all names. Man, that's awesome. So good to hear you sing. I'm Jamey Bryant. I'm one of the pastors here, and like Scott McEwen mentioned, I'm on our leadership team here as well, and it's my privilege this morning to get to kick off our Limitless Grace series, which is a study of the books of Jonah and Hosea, and I'm so excited that you're here to start that with us today. But before we do, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had someone in your life test the limits and the boundaries of your patience or maybe even your sanity? Yeah, okay. If you're a parent here, I know that's true of you because I'm also a parent. I mean, as parents, how many times have we thought or even said something like this to our kids? Hey, you're testing my limits. Anybody ever said that? I know I have. So Heather and I have two incredible daughters. They're amazing, but to be honest with you, there were some moments early on where I wasn't sure quite how things might turn out, particularly with one of ours who's slightly on the more strong-willed end of things. Anybody have one of those in their family? Okay, a few of you. Yeah, and so I can remember early on when we were trying out different consequences to see what worked when she'd get off the rails a little bit. So one of the things that we tried was taking things away, all right? So when she would act up, we'd say, hey, we're gonna take away that stuffed animal that you sleep with every night if you keep it up. And you know what she would do? She'd look at us and she'd say, I don't care. I don't like it anyway, right? Which was a total lie. She loved her stuffed animals. But this kid knew how to play hardball. And like by a month of that, we had like a trash bag full of her favorite toys and stuffed animals. One of the other things that we tried was when she would talk back to us and she'd use her ugly or mean words, we'd put just a dab or drop of something spicy on her tongue. All right, we weren't hurting her in any way, but we'd put a little drop of something spicy on her tongue. So spicy words meant a spicy mouth. And so we'd do this. And you know what she would do? She'd look up at us and she'd go, I like that. It tastes good. Which, by the way, was another total lie. She hates spicy things. And so our daughter has matured quite a bit since then. In fact, she gave me permission to share that story in case you're wondering. And we can all look back at her younger years and laugh a little bit. But I can tell you, in the moment, that really tested the limits of my patience and my sanity. You're nodding your heads. I see you out there. And so any grace I would have in that moment toward her would gradually erode with every defiant word that my little kiddo, who I love deeply, spoke back to me. Y'all, my grace has limits. And if you're honest, your grace has limits too, because we're all flawed human beings in this room. The problem is sometimes we project those same limits that we've experienced, or maybe we had a parent who had a short fuse, and we project those same limits of grace onto God Himself. We know that the Bible teaches that He is full of grace. He gives grace upon grace upon grace. Romans 5:20 even says that where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. But sometimes that is really hard to understand and even believe, because there are some things in this world that are so bad or so ugly that we just can't imagine grace covering them. And so we do one of two things. We begin to limit God's grace toward other people. Give you some examples. How did you feel when Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter in Florida, was on the stand? Our first reaction as we watch that is not normally grace. It's usually, God, I hope he gets what he deserves. Maybe we feel that way right now about Russia, who just continues to invade Ukraine. And we want God to just exercise his justice in that situation. Have you ever felt that way about the culture around you? You know, we've got this slippery slide down into the normalization of all kinds of immorality. And if you're honest, some of you just wish God would go Old Testament on it all, a pillar of salt or something. Maybe you feel that way about a friend or family member who just has some different political beliefs than you. And you wish God would show them they're wrong because you sure can't convince them otherwise. We put limits on God's grace toward others all the time. The second thing that we do when we limit God's grace is we put limits on His grace toward us. We look in the mirror and we say, God, how could you be gracious to me? Have you ever felt like you are out of God's grace? I've talked to some guys recently, and that's a phrase I've heard some people say, like, I just feel like I'm out of God's grace. And when things aren't going well, we think, man, I must have done something to offend God, because I feel outside of His grace right now. Or maybe for you, it's just that you feel abandoned by God. You're going through a really tough season, and you're going, God, where are you? Do you see what's going on? More than that, do you even care? Or for others of us, maybe we've just gone too far, or we've messed up so badly. We've hurt someone deeply, and we can't ever imagine them showing us grace. So why on earth would God? Maybe for others of us, we just continually feel like we have to earn God's love. And so if we could just try a little bit harder, maybe He'd love us more. Sometimes we put limits on God's grace toward us. And so at Faith Bible Church, we believe in this idea of free grace. It's completely free, without cost. There's no price tag attached. It has no strings attached to it. But when we limit God's grace toward others or toward ourselves, it's like we're putting a price tag on His grace, as if we could earn it. And so we begin to make two lists. One is things that we believe that are deserving of God's grace. These are the people and the things that God chases after, we sometimes think, right? The other is a list of things that we think are undeserving of God's grace. These are the people and the things that God has no interest in chasing after. But when we put limits on God's grace towards others, what it results in is apathy toward other people who need His grace. And y'all, as Christians, we can sometimes be the worst about this. We love to receive God's grace, but man, we would like Him to limit it a little bit toward other people, wouldn't we? And so we just stop caring. On the flip side of that, when we limit His grace toward us, it can lead to legalism. Just trying harder and harder to earn God's grace, to earn His favor, to earn His love. If we could just be a better person, He'd love me more. Or we just stop trying altogether because we feel like we've gone too far or messed up too badly. How we view God's grace and the limits we place on His grace impacts how we live our lives in the here and now. And so for the next 12 weeks, we're going to begin the process of removing those limits that we've placed on God's grace. And we're going to do that through the study of Jonah and Hosea. And we're going to see God's limitless grace on full display in two of the weirdest stories in all of the Bible. One about a fish swallowing up a grown man. The other about a prophet of God who marries a prostitute. And that's something that a lot of my pastor friends just avoid like the plague from the pulpit. They don't want to talk about that because it's weird and it's awkward, right? But God chose these two wild and beautiful stories to wake us up and to get our attention so that He could teach us something about His limitless grace and so that we would live differently in light of it. That's our prayer through this series. And so particularly as we study Jonah and Hosea, we're going to look at two sides of the grace coin, two aspects of grace. We'll discover that while Jonah is fine being a recipient of grace, he wants to limit God's grace toward others. And this all leads to an incredible story, which, by the way, is not really a kid's story. It's actually a punch in the gut for you and for me to wake us up to how we limit God's grace toward others. And it highlights and reveals God's gracious pursuit of everyone, whether that's a pagan people or a prodigal prophet. And then as we turn to the book of Hosea, we're going to see how Hosea's marriage to a prostitute named Gomer highlights God's loyal love and faithfulness to his unfaithful people. You see, it's really easy to point the finger at others that we don't think deserve God's grace, like Jonah did, but it's way more difficult to look in the mirror and realize that you and I are the ones that really don't deserve God's grace. You may not realize this, but every single one of us in this room is in need of recovery at some level. Ever think about that? We all have a story. We all have hurt. We all have pain. We all have experiences that desperately need to be met with and touched by and changed by the grace of God. That's why we love ministries like Regen here, where God meets our stories with his grace and changes us so that we're never the same. And so throughout this series, we will discover the beauty of God's grace is found in truly understanding what grace is at its core. And grace is undeserved favor. There's nothing that you or I could ever do to deserve it, but he gives it anyway. He gives it liberally. He gives it without cost, and it has no borders or boundaries. And he chases people with his grace relentlessly, whether that's you or me or every other prodigal or pagan person in this world. He chases rebels. And that's why taking grace is one of the main aspects here of our vision and mission as a church. We want to take grace to our world because we believe that grace is the answer for you and for me, for our city, and for the whole world. Amen? And I want to tell you about something really cool that happened in here last night that you probably don't know about. Last night, right out in our foyer, it was filled with Ukrainian families. And we got to sit around and eat a meal and celebrate their Orthodox Christmas with them. About 150 people, half of which were refugees who've only been here for less than a year. And they got to get connected to an immigration attorney who's offering services pro bono. They got to get connected with our English as a second language program. It was awesome. And we are taking grace like that to our city and to our world all the time. And I hope you get on board with that. It's really important for us here. We talk about it a lot, and we're going to talk about it a lot with this series as we dive into Jonah and Hosea together. But more than talking about it, we want to put it into practice. We want it to change us as we remove the limits of God's grace. So we're going to start our journey together in the book of Jonah. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn to Jonah chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, you can look it up on your device, or we'll just have it on the screen. But before we dive in together, I want to address the elephant in the room. It's a big gray elephant that looks a little bit more like a big gray whale. Okay, I think when we think about Jonah, like by association, I say Jonah, you say whale. Yeah, all right. So we tend to focus in and get obsessed with the whale in this book and the fish. And so we talk about the size and the species of the fish. We talk about how much breathable air would have been in its belly to keep Jonah alive and the size of its belly and all this sort of stuff. But if we focus on that, we're going to miss the point of the book of Jonah altogether. Because after all, Jonah only talks about the fish in 2 or 3 verses out of 48. So that's not the focus. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to dismiss what happened with Jonah and the fish as fictional, because it would seriously diminish the message of the book of Jonah. And so it's good and okay to believe that this really happened, that it's an historical account. Jesus talks about Jonah's experiences as being real, so that's good enough for us. And what we're going to find out is that the miracle of a fish swallowing a grown man is not the greatest miracle in the book of Jonah. There's a greater miracle than that. And if you can believe that God can turn a place like Nineveh around, and if you believe that God raised a dead man named Jesus from the dead, then the miracle of the fish is not that crazy to believe. Okay, so we want to hold those things in tension. We believe it's historical, but it's not the point of the book. So don't get hung up on the fish and don't miss the message of this book. All right, that being said, let's dive in. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. We're going to stop right there because in this first verse, we learn a lot about the context of this book. Okay, in the Old Testament, there's not a lot that's known about Jonah. But the very first readers of this book would have immediately recognized that name, Jonah, son of Amittai. Look at me with 2 Kings in chapter 14, starting in verse 23. It says this, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. And focus in on this. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant, who? Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-Hepher. So what do we know about Jonah? First thing we know is that Jonah was a prophet. If you've ever seen the VeggieTales cartoon, that song's in your head, Jonah was a prophet. Ooh, ooh. Yeah, a couple of you know that, all right. In Hebrew, that word for prophet is Navi, okay? This is not the same thing as the aliens in the Avatar movies. The Navi were prophets. They were messengers sent by God to speak on behalf of God himself. And you know, we usually think of prophets as like predicting the future, but their main role, their main function in the Old Testament was to remind God's people of their covenant relationship with him, to call them back to that. And so when we talk about covenants, covenants were used throughout the Old Testament as a way for God to kind of define his relationship with his people and also tell them where he was going. And so we're going to look at two of those covenants this morning. The first is the Abrahamic covenant that God gives to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. This covenant was full of unconditional promises that God gave to Abraham and his people. There's nothing that they had to do to make these things come to pass. They were eternal, and God alone would fulfill them. Now, a big part of this covenant was that God was going to use his chosen people as a means of blessing all nations. And that's something that's really important because that's something Jonah forgot about, as we're going to see throughout this narrative, that God wanted to bless all nations through Jonah and through his people, Israel. And so then you had the Mosaic covenant in Exodus. And this covenant was different from the Abrahamic. It was conditional. And it was temporary. It was essentially a way for God's people to tap into some of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant in their lifetime while they waited on its ultimate fulfillment. And so God said to them, if you do this, I'll do that. And so Deuteronomy 28:2 kind of gives us a picture of this. Obedience to the law of Moses would bring blessing. Look at verse 2. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. But disobedience would bring discipline. Look at verse 15. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And so what the prophets did is they held God's people accountable to the law. You can kind of consider them covenant watchdogs, or I like to think of them as covenant traffic cops, right? They're holding people accountable to God's law and what he has asked them to do. And just like you would expect traffic cops to obey the law, you would expect for God's prophets to live consistently with the words that they're speaking. Something that we're going to see Jonah not doing really quickly. So that's the context of the prophets, and it's important for us to talk about. The prophets were faithful covenant traffic cops who held people accountable to the law. And so Jonah was sent as a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. He was a prophet sent to Jeroboam II, which, as you saw in that text, Jeroboam was an evil king following in the footsteps of his father. And so interestingly, Jonah and Hosea, they were prophets who were prophesying around the same time to the northern kingdom of Israel, mid-century, 8th century BC. But their messages looked really different, okay? Hosea would have been a really good covenant traffic cop, and he called the people to repent. He held them accountable to their disobedience to law. He held Jeroboam accountable to his idolatry. Jonah, on the other hand, prophesied favorably toward Jeroboam, who was deep into sin. And Jonah said, Jeroboam, God's going to expand your borders and your boundaries in spite of your wickedness. And so this led Jeroboam and his followers to all kinds of abuses of God's grace. And so Jonah would have been considered complicit in this because he was that prophet who promised this. He didn't hold them accountable to law. He promised blessing in the midst of their disobedience. So when the first readers would have opened this and read, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, immediately they would have gone, oh, that's interesting. We remember what happened last time that happened. What's going to happen now? So immediately their interest is piqued. So then there's the meaning of Jonah's name. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but Jonah means dove, and it says son of Amittai. Amittai means faithfulness. You're meant to laugh a little bit when you read that because the people already knew a little bit about Jonah, and you know enough about Jonah to know that he is anything but innocent like a dove, and he sure isn't faithful. He doesn't live up to his name. And if we're honest with ourselves, you and I are a little bit more like Jonah than we care to admit, aren't we? Sometimes we don't live up to our name. We're called Christians. We're called Jesus followers, children of God. But how many times do we fail to live up to those names? And the world sees it. And in 2 verses in, we're going to see it in Jonah. Just how faithless he is. And immediately we begin to see the irony even in his name. And that's something important in the book of Jonah, okay? As we go through this together, the use of words and languages in the book of Jonah is really significant. It's ironic at times and hyperbolic at times. It's almost written like a satire or even a comic book to wake us up and to paint an interesting picture that gets our attention. For example, the most used word in the whole book of Jonah is great or huge. So everything's huge in Jonah, all right? 14 times. The ship is huge. The city is huge. The fish is huge. Even Jonah's emotions are huge when the writer describes those things. And so there's all these extremes in the book, and they're meant to suck us in and shock us so that we go, whoa, that's an incredible story. I can't believe Jonah's doing that. And at the end, we're meant to go, oh, wait, dang, that's me. I'm Jonah. I'm the one that limits God's grace. I'm the one that goes to Tarshish all the time. That's the power of this book, as we're going to discover as we continue through it. So the word of the Lord came to Jonah, dove, son of faithfulness. And look what God told him to do in verse 2. God said, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. So right out of the gate, Jonah's mission is clear. Go to Nineveh and call out against their evil. Nineveh was clearly on God's radar, and he wanted to do something about it. So what do we know about Nineveh? Okay, a couple of things. There's a map. Nineveh is actually where modern-day Mosul is, just on the other side of the Tigris River from Mosul. It's not to be confused with the province of Nineveh that you see up there today. I think it's interesting that they still have that name for that entire province. But in Jonah's day, the ancient city of Nineveh was 7.5 miles long, about a population of about 600,000 people. It had huge walls, 50 feet thick, 100 feet high, and it was a huge ancient city, and it was important to the Assyrian Empire, so much so that it eventually became the capital of Assyria. So it was this huge city that the book of Jonah points out, but it had a savageness that matched its size. The kings of Assyria would brag about their violent cruelty toward the people they were trying to conquer. So archaeologists there have uncovered walls and pillars with paintings and engravings on them that depicts the gruesome violence that they did toward their enemies. It included live dismemberment. It included beheading. It included skinning and burning people alive. They were vicious. And their violent conquest of other nations was a threat not just to the people right around them, it was a threat to Israel's safety and security all the time. In fact, some of the prophets prophesied that Assyria would come and bring destruction to Israel, and then they would take the northern kingdom captive, something that we know actually happened in history in 722 BC. Nineveh was bad news. So stop and think about that just for a second. How would you have felt if God had asked you to go to that place? What would your gut reaction have been toward going to Nineveh, this heart of the Assyrian Empire? To put it in perspective, how did you feel about Afghanistan right after September 11, 2001? How do you feel right now about Russia? How do you feel about North Korea when they test their missiles over and over again? God cares about nations like these? Really? He cares about them and he wants me to love people like that? Really? Talk about unlimited grace, and usually we don't like it. And we see just how much Jonah didn't like it based on the way he responds next. Look at verse 3. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Now, verse 3 is completely unexpected in normal prophetic narrative accounts. Okay, everywhere else in the Old Testament where something like that happens, when the word of the Lord comes to a prophet, the response is to go. And so the readers would have expected verse 3 to say, so Jonah rose and went to Nineveh. That would be the natural expectation. Amos in chapter 3, verse 8 says this. He says, the Lord God has spoken, who can but prophesy? It's an automatic when God speaks to you as a prophet, you go and prophesy. And so it's jolting that Jonah doesn't do this. It'd be like at a wedding when the preacher says, hey, do you take this man to be your husband? Nobody's sitting there going, oh my gosh, what she's about to say. You know, like we're not doing that. We expect the answer to be, I do. And even if there's a little pause, we kind of go, oh, okay, good, you know? This was jolting for Jonah to not do what God asked him to do. And so Jonah, son of faithfulness, does something completely different from what anyone's expecting. God's call, you remember, was to rise up and make haste and go. And so what did Jonah do? He rose to flee to Tarshish and he went down to Joppa. He made haste, but it was in the wrong direction. He went, but instead he fled. Instead of going, he fled. And instead of rising up, he went down to Joppa. And that wordplay just emphasizes how opposite Jonah's reaction was from what God asked him to do. Y'all, when we place limits on God's limitless grace, we end up leaving the God that we love, just like we sang about this morning. And we end up on a boat headed for Tarshish. So where do you go when you want to run from God? Where is that place for you? Where do you go when you run from God? If you're wondering if you place limits on God's grace, all you have to do is ask yourself honestly, am I in Tarshish right now? Am I running from what God is asking me to do? And if you find yourself in that place today, you're limiting God's grace and what he wants to do. So Jonah limited God's grace, and he fled to go to Tarshish. And that's important because it's mentioned 3 times in here. To Tarshish, to Tarshish, to Tarshish. The writer wants us to know where he went, obviously. Okay, so where is Tarshish? Most scholars think that Tarshish is in southern Spain, just west of Gibraltar. So when you see the Straits of Gibraltar in the ancient world, that was kind of the entrance to the unknown, the open ocean beyond which they knew nothing about. Tarshish was sort of like Timbuktu, the end of the known world. It was the farthest place that Jonah could think of to get away from God's call to go to Nineveh. 2,500 miles from Joppa as opposed to 550 to get to Nineveh. That's pretty extreme. Jonah's going to the ends of the earth to get away. So why on earth would Jonah do this? Not only does he do that, he goes to Joppa, which, interestingly, there were a lot of stories about big sea monsters told by the sailors there that lived out in the deep. But more interestingly, Joppa was controlled by the Philistines. And if you know anything about the Philistines, you know that they were the sworn enemies of God's people in the Old Testament. So why on earth would Jonah avoid going to one pagan enemy territory and leave and go the other direction into another pagan enemy territory? The end of verse 3 gives us the answer. He was running from the presence of the Lord. For Jonah and the people of Israel at the time, God's presence was localized to the promised land. In particular, the temple was considered the center of God's activity. It was where he was worshiped. It's where God spoke. And so Jonah's trying to get away from that place because he doesn't want to hear God speak again and tell him what to do. It's the ultimate ghosting technique. Think about how you feel when you get on a plane, right? And a few seconds in, you have no cell service and it feels good, doesn't it? That's the feeling Jonah was chasing. I want to get away from any signal that transmits God's message to me. So he goes to a pagan land. Why does he react in such an extreme way? On the surface level, I think most of us think maybe he was fearful of his life or something. I would be. I mean, going into Nineveh with this message would be like parachuting into the middle of Nazi Germany during World War II and holding up a poster board that says, "Down with the Third Reich." Okay, you'd be crazy and you'd be dead. And that was reason enough for Jonah to fear for his life in going to Nineveh. But later in the book, in chapter 4, we learn that there was another reason that Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. And it's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but it helps set the theme of the book in the context. It's in Jonah chapter 4, starting in verse 2. It says, "And Jonah prayed to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster.'" Jonah ran not because he knew what Nineveh was like. Jonah ran because he knew what God was like, and he didn't like it. Jonah knew that if he went to preach this message to Nineveh, that there was a very real possibility that they would respond and God would show his grace toward them instead of his judgment. Jonah was the prophet of borders. Do you remember that? We talked about that. Jonah is the one who prophesied to Jeroboam II that God would expand his borders. But when God even so much had hinted to Jonah that he was expanding his borders of grace, it made him mad. He didn't like that. Jonah wanted limits on his grace. And so he ran from a God who would show that kind of grace, that kind of mercy to such a horrible people. But there's one thing that Jonah forgot. It's an important truth that King David wrote about in Psalm 139. Some of you know what that is already. Psalm 139, verses 7 and 8. It's the only other time in the Old Testament the phrase of fleeing the presence of the Lord is used. David wrote this, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence?" And his answer, "If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, in the depths, you are there." Translation, there's nowhere you can run from his presence. And Jonah forgot that. So if you're in a place this morning where you're actively running from God, maybe you feel estranged from him, maybe you feel like he doesn't care or hear you, this is so important for you to hear this morning. God, in his gracious compassion for you, and in his loyal love toward you is chasing you down. He's one step behind you if you're running from him. In fact, he's actually 2 steps ahead of you. David says in Psalm 139, he knows your thoughts before you think them. He knows your actions before you do them. He hems you in on all sides. You can't outrun his grace. And if you're running this morning, all he wants you to do is just stop and pivot and see him there with open arms and run to him. That's what he's inviting you and me to do if we're running. So what Jonah would find out and what you and I need to learn is that you can't run from God and you can't run from his grace. And from this moment on, the chase of grace is on. The chase of grace for Jonah is on, and the chase of grace for Nineveh is on, and God's committed to it. He relentlessly chases the prodigals and rebels of this world with his grace, just like he does with you and me. Remember the 2 ways that we limit God's grace. We limit his grace toward others, and we limit his grace toward us. So in this moment, Jonah was an example of the first. He resented the idea that God could be gracious to such horrible people who were so undeserving, so bad and ugly. But Jonah had forgotten what God promised to Abraham. God promised to Abraham that through you and your people, I will bless all nations. Jonah was good with God being gracious to him, but he wanted to limit his grace toward others. To show grace to Nineveh in Jonah's mind was scandalous. It was reckless even. Like, God, don't you care about the results of what's going to happen if you show these people grace? And God says, no, I really don't. I'm God, and I will show grace because I'm a God who's gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, relenting from disaster. Jonah liked grace, but he liked grace with limits. What we're going to see as we continue in the book of Jonah is that God's gracious chase of pagan people and prodigal prophets, his gracious compassion shows up in some really unlikely ways. In a violent storm, in a huge fish, in an unlikely revival, and then the end of the story, which is my favorite, and I can't wait to walk through that together with you. The end of the story is Jonah sitting on a hill with a magic plant, and that is the gut punch, okay? Wait for it. These things are meant to get our attention. They're meant to wake us up and cause us to look in the mirror and consider how we limit God's grace every day. And when we do that, when we limit his grace, we limit the chase of God's grace and his pursuit of us and his pursuit of others. And I don't want to do that. So I'm praying for us and for me that God would remove the limits that we have placed on his grace so that he can get with his chase of grace in the lives of others. I want to tell you about a time when God challenged the limits that I had placed on his grace. I'll never forget this moment. I was traveling internationally, and I managed to score one of those big empty rows that, no seats in front of it, so you could kick back, put your feet on the wall, all that good stuff. And I'm one of those guys, I like my me time on an airplane. I put my headphones in. I don't really want to talk to anyone else. And so I was sitting there thinking, man, it'd be sweet if I got this whole row to myself for the whole flight. And we're about to take off. I'm like, yes, I think I got it. And in walks a dude about my age. And he comes, and I'm like, please, no, don't sit next to me. And he sits next to me. And he was clearly Muslim. He was wearing a prayer hat. He was wearing a long traditional robe, had a long beard. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but in that moment, some stereotypes started coming up in me. Some associated stereotypes. And I was thinking, man, I really don't want to talk to this guy. I felt all this tension, but I took a step anyway. And I said, hey, what's your name? We got to talking, and turns out he was coming back home from a month-long pilgrimage to Afghanistan, where he was training under one of the premier imams in Afghanistan. And so you can imagine immediately some of those associated stereotypes started coming up again, more of them. And I started putting limits on God's grace and what he could do in that moment. Just being honest, I'm not proud of that. And as we kept talking, God just kept flinging open these doors for spiritual conversation. In spite of me, in spite of the limits I put on what he could do. And somehow we found ourselves talking about the gospel, talking about Jesus, and it was so effortless. I didn't do anything to initiate that, so I don't want you to think I was being super spiritual in the moment. God just kept opening these doors, and by the end of our conversation, I got to share with this guy the full gospel, that Jesus died on a cross to forgive sins, that he was raised from the dead and offers eternal life as a free gift to anyone who simply believes him for it. Apart from anything we do, apart from religious activities or going through the motion or any works that we could do. And at the end of the conversation, he looked at me and he said, Jamey, that's the first time I've ever heard that Jesus rose from the dead. You never know what God can do in spite of us and through us if we don't limit his grace. Now, he didn't trust Christ in that moment, but God's grace to the gospel of Jesus Christ reached Ahmed's ears for the very first time, in spite of me. Y'all, I was headed toward Tarshish in that moment. I really was. But God used me in spite of me. This morning, I'd like to ask you to consider, have you boarded your own ship to Tarshish? What limits have you put on God's grace toward you or toward others? Just take a second to think about that. And even say a prayer. God, help me to see what limits I'm putting on your grace. Maybe it's toward others. Maybe it's toward a person that you know by name. Maybe it's toward a people group. Maybe when you look in the mirror, you're putting limits on God's grace toward you. You think you've outsinned his grace. You think you've gone too far. And so I'd like you to, we're going to do a little exercise. I'd like you to just take out a pen and paper. It's really simple. If you don't have a pen and paper, feel free to pull out your phone, text this to yourself. But I want you to write down this simple prayer. God, help me to see that your grace is limitless toward, and then fill in the blank. Write down that name. First name that pops in your head, or first people that pops in your head. Maybe it's me that you write in that blank. God, help me to see that your grace is limitless toward that person. If I was on the plane, again, if I could go do a do-over, I'd write Ahmed's name in there. Help me to see that your grace doesn't have limits toward Ahmed. Who is it for you? And I want you to commit to praying that God would change your view of his grace toward that person or those people or toward yourself. What limits have we put on God's grace? And let's ask God through this entire series to begin removing those limits to his grace so that we don't get in the way of his chase of grace for others and for us. His grace chases us down. It chases the world down. And you know what? I don't want to get in the way of his chase of grace. You know what would happen if we lived like God's grace is limitless? There's one word for it, and it's called revival. It's called revival. We'd see revival like Jonah saw in Nineveh. We'd see revival in our own hearts, revival in our marriages and families and our relationships. We'd see revival in our church. We'd see revival in our city. We'd see revival in our world. If we remove the limits that we've placed on God's grace and don't get in the way of him chasing people down and chasing us down. I want to live like that. Don't you? I want to live like that. I'm so excited to keep going in this series and study of Jonah and Hosea. And what we're going to see next week is God's relentless pursuit and chase of Jonah as the story continues. So I hope that you'll join us next week, that you'll be back as we continue in our Limitless Grace series.